Most systems don't collapse because people leave. They collapse because people stay, but not the way they used to. When we talk about economic pressure, we often imagine two outcomes. People either fight the system or they exit it. They protest, they migrate, they quit. But there is a third outcome that gets far less attention. People don't leave. They don't rebel. They adapt, not upward, but inward. They stop trying to escape the system and start learning how to survive inside it. And this is where the real transformation happens. In the last video, we talked about what happens when exits quietly disappear, when alternatives still exist on paper, but touching them becomes too risky, when failure stops being recoverable. At that point, people don't ask, "How do I get out?" They ask something else. "How do I make this tolerable?" That question marks a psychological shift, because once survival becomes the objective, progress is no longer required. You don't need opportunity. You don't need upside. You just need stability. Enough income not to fall, enough predictability not to panic, enough routine to feel safe. And from the outside, this looks fine. People still work. Cities still function. Nothing dramatic breaks. But internally, something fundamental has changed. A society that once optimized for building starts optimizing for endurance. Not because people became weaker, but because the system stopped rewarding movement. And when that happens, the most dangerous adaptation begins. People don't just survive the system begins to depend on people staying in survival mode. That's what we're going to unpack today. Not why people leave, but why so many don't. And what happens to a society when survival quietly replaces ambition. Survival mode doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where people say, "I've stopped trying to move forward." It happens much more quietly than that. It shows up in how decisions get framed. In a growth-oriented system, the people ask forward-looking questions. What skills should I invest in? Where should I build my life? What risks are worth taking now, so my future options expand? Those questions assume something critical, that the future is responsive. That effort today creates more room tomorrow. Survival mode flips that assumption. The future stops being a place of opportunity. It becomes a source of risk. So the questions change, not what could I build, but what mistake can I least afford? Not where can I grow, but where am I least likely to fall? Not what's the best long-term move, but what keeps me stable this year? Nothing about those questions is irrational. They are perfectly logical in an environment where error is punished. And that's why survival mode spreads so easily, because it doesn't require despair. It requires experience. Once people see that wrong timing, wrong location, or one failed experiment can set them back permanently, they adjust. They shorten their time horizon. 5-year plans disappear. 10-year visions feel naive. Life becomes quarterly: rent, bills, renewals, next paycheck. This is not because people lack imagination. It's because imagination becomes expensive. Projecting into the future creates expectations, and expectations in unstable systems lead to disappointment. So people learn not to project. They stop planning families until everything feels secure. They stop switching careers until conditions feel perfect. They stop starting things until risk disappears. And of course, risk never disappears. So waiting becomes permanent. From the outside, this looks like caution. From the inside, it feels like paralysis. But here's the crucial part. People in survival mode are not inactive. They're incredibly busy. They optimize budgets. They negotiate rent. They manage debt. They compare prices. They research endlessly. Energy is still being spent. It's just being spent on preservation, not expansion. Life becomes a maintenance task. And maintenance has a very different psychology from progress. Progress creates momentum. Maintenance creates fatigue. Because no matter how well you maintain it, you never get ahead. You just stay in place. And over time, that changes how people see themselves. They don't think of themselves as builders anymore. They think of themselves as managers of risk, not because they wanted that identity, but because the system trained them into it. This is how survival mode normalizes, not through fear, through repetition. And once it becomes normal, something else quietly disappears. Ambition stops being social. People still want things privately, but they stop talking about them. Dreams sound irresponsible in a world that punishes deviation. So people keep their heads down. They survive, and survival begins to look like adulthood. Survival mode doesn't stay individual for long. Once enough people start making the same cautious choices, those choices stop looking like adaptation. They start looking like norms. What was once a response to pressure slowly becomes the definition of being responsible. Ambition gets rebranded, not as dangerous, but as immature. Taking risks starts to sound reckless. Long-term planning sounds naive. Believing things will improve sounds out of touch. And none of this happens because people became cynical. It happens because experience rewrote expectations. In a survival-oriented culture, the people who aim lower are praised for being realistic. The people who delay life decisions are described as sensible. And the people who still talk about growth, about building, about upside down, they get quietly dismissed. Must be nice to think like that. You'll understand when you're older, that's not how the world works anymore. This is how ambition gets socially regulated, not by policy, by tone. The culture doesn't forbid wanting more. It makes wanting more embarrassing. And once that happens, something critical changes. People stop encouraging each other to grow. They start encouraging each other to cope. Advice shifts. Instead of, how do I move forward? The question becomes, how do I avoid getting hurt? Instead of what's possible, it becomes, what's realistic? But realism in this context isn't about understanding constraints. It's about accepting them as permanent. And when that belief spreads, the system gains enormous stability. Not because it's good, but because no one is pushing against it anymore. This is why survival mode is so powerful. It doesn't need enforcement. People enforce it on each other. They warn friends not to take risks. They discourage younger people from dreaming. They pass down caution as wisdom. And slowly, the entire culture recalibrates downward. The danger here isn't that people stop wanting better lives. It's that wanting better stops being visible. Dreams go underground. People still want more money and more time, more freedom. But they stop organizing their lives around those wants. They organize around safety instead. And safety in a distorted system is a shrinking target. So the culture adapts again. Expectations lower, hopes narrow, time horizons shorten. This is how survival mode becomes self-reinforcing. The system creates pressure. People adapt. The adaptation stabilizes the system. And once that loop is established, change becomes very difficult. Because breaking out of survival mode doesn't just require better conditions. It requires social permission, permission to hope again, permission to risk again, permission to believe. That effort might actually lead somewhere, and that permission is the first thing survival culture takes away. Once survival mode becomes widespread, the system starts to change its behavior too. Not consciously, not through some central plan, but structurally. Because a population in survival mode is incredibly predictable. People don't move much. They don't take big risks. They don't demand large changes. They prioritize stability over improvement. And for a system under pressure, that is extremely convenient. Systems don't need people to be happy. They need people to be functional, to show up, to pay, to comply with routines. A society in survival mode does all of that reliably. People keep working, even if work no longer leads anywhere. They keep servicing debt, even if it never meaningfully shrinks. They keep participating, even if the upside disappeared years ago. From a system perspective, this looks like success. This is where a dangerous dependency forms. The system begins to rely on people not taking risks. Because risk creates volatility. Risk creates failure. Failure creates pressure. Pressure creates demands for reform. Survival mode eliminates that. When people are focused on not falling, they don't have energy to push for change. They don't organize around growth. They organize around protection. And protection is easier to manage than aspiration. This is why systems that drift into survival dependence often resist genuine reform, not because reform is impossible, but because reform reintroduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is terrifying. To people who have learned that mistakes are permanent, even beneficial change feels dangerous in a survival-oriented environment. So people resist it, not because they love the status quo, but because they're afraid of losing the little stability they have left. This creates a paradox. The system needs people to stay cautious, to remain stable, but that same caution prevents the system from renewing itself. Growth requires risk, innovation requires failure, renewal requires movement. Survival mode suppresses all three. Over time, the system begins optimizing, not for progress, but for endurance. Policies prioritize short-term calm. Institutions protect existing structures. Narratives emphasize realism, restraint, patience. Anything that threatens movement gets labeled irresponsible, and slowly the future gets postponed indefinitely. The system doesn't collapse. It hardens, like metal bent too many times. Without being reshaped, strong under familiar loads, brittle under new ones. And because nothing dramatic happens, this brittleness goes unnoticed until something external applies pressure, a shock, a demographic shift, a technological change, and then the system struggles to respond. Not because it lacks resources, but because it trained its people not to move. This is the hidden cost of survival-based stability. It creates a society that can endure stress, but cannot adapt to opportunity. A system that survives by relying on survival mode is not preparing for the future, it's postponing it. Survival is not a failure. In unstable conditions, it's a rational response. People adapt to survive because survival is necessary. But survival was never meant to be permanent. And that's the danger. A society can survive for a very long time. Without progressing, it can function, it can remain orderly, it can look stable from the outside, but internally something essential is missing: progress. Progress requires more than endurance. It requires belief. That effort leads somewhere. It requires room to fail without being ruined. It requires the possibility that taking a risk actually improves your position. Survival mode offers none of that. It keeps people afloat, but it keeps them in place. This is why systems that depend on survival eventually turn against themselves. They preserve routines instead of creating futures. They optimize behavior instead of expanding opportunity. They reward caution instead of initiative. And over time, that they drain the very thing that made them viable in the first place: human momentum. When survival becomes the norm, progress starts to feel dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the fragile balance people rely on to stay afloat. Change introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty reintroduces risk, and risk feels intolerable in a survival-based system. So progress gets postponed again and again and again. This is how societies drift, not backward, but sideways. They don't collapse, they don't revolt. They simply stop moving forward. And because survival continues to work, no one feels an immediate need to fix anything until time runs out. Survival mode was never meant to be a destination. It's supposed to be temporary, a bridge between disruption and renewal. But when systems remove exits and then train people to survive inside constraints, the bridge becomes a cage, comfortable enough to endure, too risky to leave. And this is the final cost. A society that confuses survival with health will protect stability. Even when stability prevents life from improving, it will keep people functioning while quietly erasing the future. In the next video, we'll look at what happens when progress itself becomes dangerous, when growth threatens stability, when systems begin to punish improvement, because improvement reintroduces choice. If this helped you recognize why survival feels necessary, but also why it feels empty, subscribe, not for motivation, not for optimism, but for clarity. Because once you understand the difference between surviving and progressing, you get to decide whether staying is enough.